Welcome back for our third panel on our discussion.
We gave money to him for his overall setup, but I don't think for this one. So we have to.
Barack Obama is in fact giving a speech at Independence Hall at 6 p.m. tonight, which will not lead to any closure of any roads, but may lead to a certain amount of congestion. So I originally assumed that we'd leave at 6:30 from the hotel, and I really lied and said we really are actually going to have to leave at 6:30 from the hotel. So if you could be there a little bit before then. And if you know, there's two entrances to the hotel. One is in a turnout circle, and the other is along the street. If you go to the side, it's on Walnut Street. The bus will need to pick up on the Walnut Street side because it cannot make a turn around in the circle. So if you would meet there at 6:30, that would be good. Okay. Appropriate for our next panel, which is on structural separation, I thought I'd share with you a clip that Luke Frobe was nice enough to point out to me, which I thought was the ideal way to open this panel, which is from the well-known, of course,
Meanwhile, big news in the telecom industry, Singular is changing its name to AT&T. It is a crushing blow to those of us who have come to love the Singular trademark, whatever the hell that is. As you no doubt remember, Singular was co-owned by Bell South and SBC, which had been Southwestern Bell and Ameritech. Weeks before that had been Illinois Bell, Wisconsin Bell, Michigan Bell, Ohio Bell, and Indiana Bell. All those used to be AT&T. A couple of years ago, Singular bought AT&T Wireless and renamed it Singular, but then SBC bought AT&T and changed its own name to AT&T. Then that new AT&T bought Bell South, changing its name to AT&T, making it only logical to turn Singular into AT&T. And down here too. In other words, thanks to America's antitrust efforts, the country has gone from this to this. AT&T is the T1000 corporation. No matter how many pieces you break it into, it always comes back together.
This also gives me the pleasure of doing an introduction of Dorothy Atwood, who's going to moderate the next panel. She was, I believe, the staff legal advisor to Chairman Kennard, and was the head of the Common Carrier Bureau during the time that many, if not most, of the Section 271 petitions were granted. But my real motives in introducing her is she is also a distinguished graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and for that we welcome her back.
Thank you. That's great. And a lot of money was spent on that small case, AT&T. It's very important. There was a discussion about wanting to have that last piece when the golden, the Terminator comes up, to make that golden boy, because that was really something that was really important to everybody at AT&T. One of the things we've learned now from these early panels is that there's no problem in creating the right time to fill the panel, so the moderator's role is really easy. It's just sending notes down, making sure everybody at least adheres to some semblance of a 12 to 15-minute rule. So I really want to get going, and we've now moved from a discussion about access to a discussion more about issues of structural separation, what that means, what historically that means, what lessons we can learn from that, what does it suggest to the international market, and so with that, I think we'll start. We can start with you, and we'll move down same line.
Okay, thank you. I was inspired by Roger Knoll's remarks this morning to go for the big picture. And so that's what I'm going to do, which will mean not sticking narrowly to the issue of separation, although that issue certainly comes up. Roger talked about the intellectual war, if that's the right word, I don't think it was his word, between believers in competition and believers in government regulation. I think within the admittedly narrow community of those who believe in or who are interested in microeconomic policy, even those who are interested in competition policy, there's a comparable war of ideas going on now that for some reason doesn't get talked about in these terms very much, but is in fact, I think, a war between those who believe in competition, meaning something that is a little difficult to tease out, and those who believe in management. So management, of course, can be government regulation, but it can also mean management of a complement by a firm that controls a powerful position in a particular market. Okay? And so if we're talking, as we are, of course, about net neutrality, it can mean management of the applications sector by a firm with a powerful position in broadband access. And I think the big difference in this area, there are a number of them, but I think perhaps the biggest is between those who think that, A, it's true, between those who think that to say they don't have an incentive to do anything inefficient in their negotiations / interaction with the applications sector, between those who think that that statement is A, true, and B, an answer to the question, versus those who think it's either untrue or, more radically, think it might be true or might not be true, but it's not really an answer to the question. Okay, and I'm going to try to explain some of the thinking that I wrestle with that lies behind that formulation. I think there have been and are being, if that's the right phrase, a couple of huge linguistic and conceptual shifts in competition policy in recent decades. One shift is to come pretty close to redefining the word competition as meaning economic efficiency. Now, I'm an economist, and I recognize that a lot of good is done, or can be done, and has been done, by moving away from purely formal concepts of what competition means towards some sort of focus on the economic consequences of this or that. But I think there's a huge danger in it, too, that's been much less recognized. And the huge danger is that if you define the word competition to mean efficiency, you make it impossible, as a logical matter, for there to be a presumption that competition is efficient. Why? Because in order to apply such a presumption, you have to say, this is competition, therefore without proving that it's efficient, I have a presumption that it is. But of course, if you've redefined competition to mean that which is efficient, you can't prove that it's competition to start with. So it's been very salutary in many ways, but it also really risks gutting a presumption that is at the core of competition policy to pursue that redefinition of the word competition. I think that's important. It's related to, but a little different from what I want to talk about this afternoon. And that is a shift in what we focus on in competition policy, a little bit away from customers generally have plenty of alternatives, and therefore this firm couldn't really hurt them significantly, even if it tried, protection against incompetence as well as greed, using competition, versus the phrase typically is there's enough competition to discipline pricing, and aside from the focus on pricing versus other aspects of competition, what that really means is this firm may have a lot of power, but our analysis of its incentives suggests that it won't abuse that power. Those are different statements. Okay? Both of them result from there being enough competition in some sense, but they may result with different amounts of competition. They result in different ways, and one of them protects against incompetence as well as greed. The other one protects only against greed. My impression of the world is that both greed and incompetence are fairly common, but it would be unwise to protect only against one of them if we had the opportunity to try to protect against both. Okay. So incentives matter a lot in competition, but they may not be the only things that matter. When you admit the possibility that some executive may not fully understand the economics of vertical relations, and I don't fully understand the economics of vertical relations, it starts to become a little worrying to rely too much on our modeling of what their incentives are likely to be. Now, let me say up front, I meant to say earlier actually, and I'll say again at the end, this doesn't tell us what to do if you remain worried about those things. But it does mean we would apply some skepticism to the arguments that say there's probably no problem because I have a view of what their incentives are going to be that says they won't have an incentive to exploit whatever power they might have. Okay. So, what does this have to do with separation? Well, it has a lot to do, I think, with vertical integration and also with separation. Obviously, if you have separation, at least if it's cleanly done and or effectively done, there's no way that a firm can mess with the complement. If you have integration, then there's potentially more scope and potentially more temptation. On the other hand, economic analysis does say that outside the context of regulation, which was the Baxter effect, there's some presumption that a firm with, let's call it for the moment, bottleneck power, has an incentive to manage a complement efficiently. Okay? That's sometimes called the one monopoly rent theorem. Phil Weiser and I have called it the internalization of complementary efficiencies, or ICE. There are a number of exceptions. Regulation is one of them. I don't want to focus here on the details of the particular exceptions that economists have identified and studied. The real question is, should we trust, well, it may not be the real question. The question that I want to address now, should we trust this model of their incentives more or less than some policy-based intervention to ensure competition in that component? And it seems to me the answer to that question is far from obvious. So let me echo actually something that Tim Wu said this morning. I think you can arrange industries in some sense on a spectrum between, let me provocatively call them boring and interesting. In a boring industry, we pretty much know what it is that ought to be done. And the question is getting it done at reasonably low cost, reasonably efficiently, and lowish price. Okay? To a significant extent, that may be a management problem that could be well addressed by a powerful organization that manages that process of getting this thing built or getting this done. Okay? And then the idea that an integrated firm has good incentives to manage the complement may be the right kind of thing to think about. Okay? On the other hand, in other spheres of activity, it may be more important to have imagination, inspiration, inspired innovation, and kinds of quality or variety that are hard to manage, hard to specify contractually, and hard even to reward on the part of employees. There, management is more of a challenge, and free and open competition is likely to have a stronger comparative advantage. Okay? Now notice that the kinds of industries where incentives are key, where you can manage your way to a good outcome, those are the ones where if you analyze the incentives, and notice that the incentives may be relatively simple there also, as in addition to the activities, the Chicago-style competition policy that focuses on incentives for this powerful player may be getting it approximately right. On the other hand, in the second kind of industry, if you look at incentives for a powerful player, you may be missing a big fraction of what's going on. Okay? And that may have some shades of pre-Chicago competition policy, that you value what might be naively called competition, or in a very sophisticated way called competition, but is different from incentives analysis. You value it for reasons that are a little bit difficult to specify and clarify in an incentives-focused subject like modern post-Chicago or Chicago economics. Okay? So, where does this go in telecom access? It seems to me, and I'd like to hear more discussion of this in this conference, which is, after all, supposedly about the breakup of AT&T. Perhaps long distance turns out, though we may not have known it at the time, to have been a relatively boring industry. One where having a competitive or fairly competitive long-distance sector was at best a means of getting costs and prices down, things that might well have been done by Bell system engineers. Now, you can have alternative views of that. For example, the political economy would never have got the access charges or markups down without the divestiture and so on. But it seems to me, from the point of view of manageable tasks versus imagination and innovation, our experience with the long-distance industry puts it more into the category of manageable tasks. On the other hand, if you look at customer premises equipment, if you look at DSL, which, as I understand it, emerged from the much maligned loop unbundling, okay, there, DSL was not being introduced by the Bell companies. Whatever you might think about their incentives to introduce it, they didn't. It was introduced when somebody else, somebody you'd never heard of, got a shot at doing it without having to build a local infrastructure. So obviously you don't want to take too much from one anecdote or a handful of anecdotes, but it seems to me consistent with that overall lesson. Now, as an intellectual, and perhaps more than as an intellectual, it seems to me important to make the following observation. There's something you might call meta-management. A firm might recognize the fact that such and such an activity needs diversity, openness, imagination, and so on, and say, therefore, we will voluntarily refrain from putting our heavy feet into that. And I think there's a lot to that. It also seems to me possible, though, that people will overestimate their own competence, and people who are skilled and successful at management may overestimate their ability to manage the process. There's a fascinating article by Rebecca Henderson and Annabelle Gawler in GEMS, maybe about 4 years ago, on how Intel tries hard to deal with the contradictions between wanting to be integrated into complements to its core business and wanting to avoid some of the pitfalls of integration. There are plenty of successful examples, but it seems to me there are also plenty of not so successful examples. So I take the view, I'm wrestling with these issues very much, but I take the view overall that there is likely to be a real social value to having diverse, open, free, and in a very old-fashioned sense competitive structure in some activities, and that that's a somewhat separate consideration from the incentives to provide good outcomes in those activities. Integration can provide good incentives, and that sometimes works well. Integration can be consistent with this meta-management point, but that's often a difficult trick to pull off. And there are circumstances, perhaps, where firms don't even have the incentives to try. So where does this leave me? I don't know. I understand Mike Salinger is going to point out some of the difficulties of trying to do anything about any of this kind of stuff, even if you believe me. But I think...
And I do believe you.
What?
I do believe you.
But I think modern competition policy, and we are talking here about competition policy, telecom policy has become competition policy. I think modern competition policy may have gone a bit too far, or may have become a bit too doctrinaire, is perhaps a better way of putting it, in focusing on incentives and leaving out, well, I'm not quite sure what it is that it's leaving out, but something about the value of openness and diversity and imagination as distinct from incentives.
Ellie?
And is this my control? Let me just check this. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Dorothy. It must be nice to have your company named after you.
Yeah, it's .at too, by the way.
Thank you, Chris, and Godspeed to TIC. Now, the topic here is the divestiture of AT&T and what we can learn from it. And academics, we've just also heard about this, kind of, when they think about policy and policy improvement, have in the back of their mind something along these lines. You take an industry that has some problems, a boring industry, you apply some general principles that cut across industries. You change the thinking of policymakers, and voila, you result in innovation, efficiency, and all these good things. And so as academic economists and lawyers, 25 years ago, we all cheered with admiration as the Stanford law professor and his small band of brother economists took on the world's largest company, and the Pentagon even, as we heard, and some of their own Justice Department folks, and the states, and the unions, and the rural folks, and the consumer organizations, and they won. Hallelujah. But in a way, we not just want to talk about the past, but the issues really are relevant, in particular, in looking into the future, which is what can we learn from this particular example of structural separation. Because that issue is around. For example, but not only, in Europe, the separation issue, functional separation, is very much on the agenda. And I've kind of spoken about this a number of times in Europe and here. And I've kind of concluded that it's a bit like, it reminds me of the sayings that every generation believes that it has invented sex. So the Europeans now believe that they have found an approach that is new and perhaps even more important, that is not American, which is separation. But of course, separations have been, policies of various kinds have been tried in a whole variety of ways in America for kind of almost 100 years. Structural separation, functional separation, accounting separation, geographic separation, unbundling separation, business line separation. There's and a whole bunch of other things like open network architecture and what have you. It's been around and around and around. We've tried everything, and arguably none of them has worked terribly well. And so now Europeans, led by the formidable Madame Reding, are kind of moving in the same directions. And there are a whole bunch of things that can be argued against this functional separation policy. It's static, it's asymmetric, it creates perverse incentives, it retains market power, it reduces internal coordination, it does this and it does that. The problem, however, is as much as I can argue these, I'm fair enough to recognize that somebody else could make pretty good arguments on the other side. So in some ways, the analytic arguments don't solve the problem. I think that ultimately you just have to look at the facts and what happened. And so this is one of the things I'd like to do here, come up with some numbers about the AT&T divestiture to see what we can learn about it. And I'd like to present some data, which I hope I will be excused doing so in a law school, but I will also kind of compare it to a company that was very similar, namely Bell Canada, in a country that is similar. And I actually admire your provost, because he already kind of anticipated my talk by saying, well, what about Canada? First, let's perhaps start by observing and reminding ourselves how truly huge AT&T was. This is kind of the top 25 companies in the U.S. information sector with a U.S. domestic revenue. So IBM is larger, but its U.S. revenue was kind of only a third or so of its general revenue. So AT&T is just kind of like off the charts big. And not only that, it was also a monopoly, largely, in an essential service, and truly there's never been anything like it in American business history. And there never will be, probably, almost certainly. And so it was no wonder that its dominance was challenged and that the giant was broken up. But of course it's not the end of the story. And so 25 years later, and we've seen that clip, we have here this is some calculation of mine over the years of the HHI for the pooled, that is all components of the telecommunications market. I I've done it also for the separate submarkets, but if you kind of put them all together, you see the lower line is the HHI line, the upper line is the C4 line, the share of the top 4 companies. And if you see those two hatched lines at the bottom there, anything that's below that hatched line is below an HHI of 1,000, which is unconcentrated. Everything that's above that higher hatched line is at higher concentration, at a high concentration, highly concentrated by Department of Justice guidelines. And so you can see that the telecommunications concentration dropped like a stone, of course, by divestiture in 83, 84. And then it kind of still gently came down, approached the range of low concentration, didn't like it, turned around, and climbed rapidly up again. And that's kind of the trend that you see. So the United States, after a huge, long, protracted struggle, battle, expensive, is back to an HHI of 2,900 approximately. And Canada, without any of this son et lumière, the HHI is at 2,600 approximately. In the United States, the top company, AT&T, has 42%, and in Canada, Bell Canada has 42%. In the United States, the number 2 company is Verizon with 28%, and in Canada, Telus has 22%. It seems kind of had an easier time to achieve exactly the same result. If we now look at the long-distance service, remember that was going to be the one that was liberated. The kind of clearly what you see is indeed a very short, sharp drop to in constant market concentration, but still to a level that is still highly concentrated above that higher hatched line at about 2,000 or so, an HHI of 2,000. So we have here an oligopoly at the best. And the reason is not that there were some gullible regulators and legislatures, but rather that this supposedly wonderfully lucrative long-distance business turned out to be, as any clear-headed analysis would have shown, a commodity business. And its prices came down and down and down, great for us consumers, but eventually AT&T, the old AT&T, the capital letter AT&T, ended up out of money, and WorldCom ended up in prison. So now, and here's another industry that kind of wasn't even contemplated at the time. In fact, AT&T was so confused they didn't know what to do with it, and so was McKinsey. But you can see here, too, that over time the market shares, the concentration has increased and keeps increasing into the high territory, despite the fact that the federal government in a variety of ways tried everything that they could to make it more fragmented and more local and more franchised and everything, but it's just kind of moving in that direction. So we should kind of learn something from that. Now, what about local competition? Local competition is the one thing also that the AT&T divestiture didn't really contemplate, because it thought that it was naturally monopolistic and for all practical purposes was going to be probably permanent, but it didn't happen quite that way. I'm just skipping a bunch of things. Here's my summer place, and on it you can see 4 infrastructures. Okay, there is the AT&T mobile phone, there's the Verizon landline phone. On the same phone, there's also the Comcast VoIP, cable VoIP, and then there's Sprint, a cellular phone, my wife's. And so we basically have, in the middle of the woods, kind of 4 infrastructures. But that has really kind of, and so in consequence, you can also see that local concentration has declined. It's still quite high, no question about it, but it's not what it was before, which was kind of like an HHI of 10,000, 100% almost. But it's important to understand that for this, no divestiture was necessary. In many countries, wireless is a vigorous competitor to landlines without a divestiture. In many other countries, VoIP is strong. In Canada, in fact, VoIP's penetration is half as much, 50% higher than it is in the United States. Okay, for reasons of time, let me kind of rapidly kind of move this. What about growth? Okay, let's just say then that for growth, that is in revenue terms, if you take the old AT&T and compare it to, let's call it the virtual AT&T, all the successor companies of AT&T put together, add them up, their growth rate has been, their growth, not rate, in 25 years have been 31%, including inflation, considering inflation already. So 25%, that's a very, very low growth rate, in fact. In Canada, Bell Canada is still not very high, but it's twice as high. What about market capitalization? Again, I don't have time to go through the details here, as you can see, but let's just say that if you look at the market capitalization of Bell Canada and of AT&T 25 years ago and compare them today, AT&T being, again, the successor companies added up, the capitalization of Bell Canada is 3 times as high as all of the AT&T family today. And so, well, I will kind of skip a bunch of things here. Kind of one thing to say is, again, one of those unanticipated collateral damage issues is the R&D issue. Okay, you can see the number of researchers engaged in telecommunications R&D. Well, this is kind of inside AT&T or the AT&T family, which of course excludes Cisco and so on, but nevertheless, when it comes to the AT&T Bell Labs, Bell Core type family of kind of research institutions, this went down. This is 2002 ends, but after that it actually dropped some more because Lucent basically sold itself to a French company, Alcatel. And the consequence on research, you can see from the following graph, which shows on publications in IEEE type publications, that most of the publications used to be from people in the industry. And that is that kind of rapidly dropping line. And today, most of the publications come from academia, actually, which from our perspective is not a bad thing, I suppose, but it also means that the kind of research contribution of the private sector have declined considerably in this field, at least in its public component. So in Canada, Nortel went through some similar problems, but still its research capacity has remained much stronger than whatever is left from AT&T. And so, to conclude, 25 years after the AT&T divestiture, the overall market concentration in telecom is up by almost 1,000 points on the HHI index. Local market concentrations, the good news, is down by 20%, but there's no evidence that the divestiture has an effect on such local competition. Market valuation of AT&T in comparison to Bell Canada is only 1/3. Revenue is only 1/2. Reduction of R&D considerable. In comparison to Canada, the U.S. has a lower VoIP penetration, lower mobile penetration, lower broadband penetration. Now, none of this, in my mind, suggests that the divestiture per se, or some form of divestiture, was not justified. Not justified in the sense of a size reduction of a company that was so dominant that perhaps it was just too much for the political economic system. So it's more less on an efficiency grounds and more on a political economy grounds. And this would have argued for a simple size reduction of the company. And in a way, not such a complicated vertical, horizontal, diagonal, and what have you type separations, divestitures, definitions, Judge Green, state commissions, what have you. And that's in a way how Japan or Canada have been moving to this, a kind of maybe 2-3 horizontal companies, like maybe we should have had AT&T East, AT&T West, and AT&T Central, something like that, vertically integrated. And in that system in the United States, there will of course also be cable companies in the mix. Not a hugely competitive system, but not a natural monopoly, maybe a natural oligopoly system. Less than monopoly, but more than less than competition, but better than monopoly. And obviously, there will be some market power which has to be dealt with in a variety of ways: common carriage, net neutrality, and kind of variations of of access, of opening of access. So, to conclude then, in 1983, the U.S. had the best telecom system in the world and was ahead by every measure. In 2008, it still has a pretty good system, and it is definitely one of the top 15 countries. So what were the major variables then in comparison to Canada? The U.S. had divestiture, and Canada didn't. Now, if you have a better theory, let's hear it. Thank you.
Great. Michael.
My technical support here. So I'm inspired by Joe to look at the small picture, and my subject is structural separation in the context of universal service. It's not an obvious context, I guess. The high-cost universal service program is about $4 billion today. This is the money that we pay to small, high-cost rural telephone companies to stay in business. It used to be about $2 billion, and the reason why it's $4 billion now is, to a large extent, is we're paying for the same thing twice. We give the subsidies to the incumbent local exchange carrier, and then we give another subsidy to a competitive, eligible telecommunications carrier as well. The $4 billion is not a lot of money in the big scheme of things. It's barely more than the annual income of a successful hedge fund manager today. But it's real money, and the policy issue, to some extent, is whether or not we can get that $4 billion back down to $2 billion, or whether or not we're going to grow it to $8 billion or more. And the FCC's recent response to this is to propose the idea of using an auction mechanism to determine the magnitude of these subsidies. And the idea of universal service auctions has been around for a fair amount of time now. Dennis Weller had a proposal some years ago for it. Evan Querell occasionally becomes interested in the idea. Paul Milgram advocated the idea when he accepted the Nobel Prize on behalf of William Vickery, who had passed away, unfortunately, before receiving it, for Vickery's seminal works on auction theories. So it's a respectable idea, and it's something that the FCC has finally put forward. So what are the goals? What's the purpose of it? Well, the ostensible goal is to somehow make the magnitude of the subsidy responsive to market forces rather than a regulatory proceeding. And whether or not that will result in a $2 billion fund or an $8 billion fund might be a gleam in the eyes of the beholder. I don't know. But a loftier goal of the policy, and perhaps a long-run objective, might be to provide universal service in high-cost rural areas with the most efficient technologies we can. If we were to have a greenfield problem today, we would probably, in most cases, be using wireless technology to provide telephone service in rural areas. That's what we see in China. That's what we see in places like India. It's a lower-cost technology. But in the U.S., we have this legacy plant. We have this history. We have these sunk wireline assets in place. And one way to phrase the question is, how do we, or should we, perhaps, transition from that less efficient technology to a more efficient technology? What's the path to do that? And can an auction mechanism achieve that? And particularly, can it adapt in a dynamic way? There's something about dynamics in the title of this panel. Technology is changing over time, and least cost methods of supplying services, and even the nature of the services you want to supply, are obviously changing over time. So the NPRM, the FCC's NPRM, raises all kinds of issues about how to design an auction that have to do with should there be a single winner or multiple winners, what should be the obligations of the winner, should the subsidy just be a check written to the company, or should it be a voucher pinned to the sweaters of consumers? Lots of technical issues about the size of the geographic area, which matter very much depending on whether or not you're a wireless carrier or an incumbent carrier, and so on. What's not discussed in the NPRM are access issues. And what's not discussed, which is the elephant in the room, I think, is what happens if the incumbent loses. The incumbent has this huge investment in plant and equipment to which it arguably is entitled to some fair rate of return, and how's it going to be compensated for this stuff if it loses? Also, it's the same question if it wins, because the whole purpose of the auction mechanism is to squeeze down the subsidies, and it's not clear that the squeezed down subsidy is also going to compensate the incumbent for embedded costs as well. On the other hand, there is a lot of fat in there because we've been paying for the same thing twice, so maybe there is room to compensate the incumbent. So anyway, my purpose is to unpack these access issues and stranded cost issues a little bit in this sandbox of universal service, and to opine a little bit or reflect a little bit on what role structural separation might have in that regard. I should say that there are legal issues invoked by this. I mean, to actually do something along these lines, it might be necessary for the FCC to change its rules regarding the provision of unbundled access. It may be necessary to change aspects of the law. That's really not my concern, but I do note that the fact that to some extent that these networks have been built with what are effectively public funds over the past several years might provide a case for providing some stronger obligations on these companies that we might put on others. So the access issue, as I see it, is that a competitor, say perhaps a wireless competitor seeking to provide service in a rural area, universal service in a rural area, might, in order to provide it in the least cost, most efficient way, might benefit by having access to the incumbent's network. It might be most efficient for a wireless carrier to serve some consumers wirelessly, others over the wireline network, for others to have a combination of facilities. Who knows what the efficient mix of technologies are. And moreover, evolving technologies and consumer demands and products might lead to shifts in what these access requirements over time. So the problem is that denial of efficient access to an incumbent's network might, number one, discourage anyone from participating in these universal service auctions at all, which would be a good way to get the fund up to $8 billion pretty quickly, probably. It might distort the auction outcome, so we might not necessarily have the most efficient business model, winning the franchise. And as we discussed this morning, sort of the denial of access might also dampen the creation of new business models and products and so on that consumers might benefit from. So what do I mean by structural separation? And can I work this technology? Is some type of mandatory unbundling of network elements in a vertically separated enterprise. So there would be an upstream network company that, much as the box were required to do, would be required to provide non-discriminatory access to its network on regulated terms and conditions that were predictable. It would be pretty important probably for a competitor to have some predictability about what these costs were before it decided what it was willing to bid in an auction like this. The downstream service company of the ILEC would sell retail services. It would compete in the auction. It might also be selling advanced services in addition to the sort of the services that were covered by the universal service policy. In the course of doing this along with competitors, it would purchase on parity terms access to the network as needed. The stranded cost problem might be thought of as a problem for the network company. If the network assets lived in the upstream company, it might view itself as being entitled to some rate of return on its legacy rate base, and the means for recovering its embedded costs might be profits from the sale of network access services. It might be profits from wholesale advanced services. I think this is part of the idea of the proposal, is to find a way for profits from DSL services to effectively contribute to the universal service burden. But to the extent that there were stranded costs, there would very likely be an issue about compensating those stranded costs from some sort of universal service fund, much as that issue arose in electricity markets in recent years. Think about these issues, I sort of, as is my want, to constructed a simple model. There's a little bit of notation and equations there. Those are really just intended for the economists, much in the same way that subtitles are for the English speakers in an Italian opera, so they're not really essential for appreciating what I have to say. But the simple model is that there's an ILEC and a CLEC that compete in a reverse auction. Whoever wins the auction would have a carrier of last resort obligation to serve an area at some regulated retail price. That initially that price is less than the incumbent's cost, so the incumbent requires some subsidy in order to be viable under those terms and conditions. The CLEC would like to have access to the incumbent's network, and its willingness to participate in this auction. In other words, the smallest subsidy that it's willing to take to participate will depend on those terms and conditions. Will depend on the price at which it has access. Similarly, the incumbent's willingness to participate in the auction, or the willingness to bid in this auction, will depend on the terms of that access as well. So first observation, which is a standard observation, is that the higher is the price of access relative to the cost of actually providing access, the less aggressive will be the bidding in this auction. And the reason is that if access is expensive, the competitor will view itself as having a higher cost and therefore requiring a larger subsidy. And from the ILEC standpoint, the higher is the price of access, the more profitable it will be to be a network services company. The opportunity cost of winning the auction will be larger, and so it will bid less aggressively as well. So the higher is the price of access, somewhat paradoxically, because the price of access could go towards covering embedded costs, the less aggressive will be competitive bidding, and the higher will be the winning subsidy, no matter which firm wins. So it also creates an interesting dual jurisdiction problem if the price of access is set by state regulators and the subsidies are paid out of a federal universal service fund. You can see what the incentive of the state regulators would be.
Sounds great.
The problem here is that if you set the price of access too high, there'll be an incentive for competitors to bypass the use of the incumbent's network and use its own facilities, and that will lead to some distortion in terms of what's the most efficient technology for serving the area. Where am I here? Doesn't work. Forget that. So the stranded cost problem can emerge if the incumbent has a historical cost or embedded cost that's greater than the cost of access. As I mentioned before, is that there may be some claim to recovery of that embedded cost. And here's where I think that that structural separation might actually be helpful, to come back to my topic. So on the one hand, if you promise to compensate the embedded cost of the incumbent, in other words, at the end of the day, to leave the incumbent whole, the incumbent's not going to have much incentive to bid aggressively in the auction. It will blunt incentives for bidding in the auction. And the reason is because it doesn't matter. If no matter what I bid, if I have the stranded costs left over, I'm going to be compensated for. What difference does it make? One thought is that structural separation might put these stranded costs under the umbrella of the upstream network company. It was the upstream network company that would be entitled to recover whatever stranded costs there were. The downstream company would be entitled to make profits if it could do so as an outcome of the auction. So it would essentially be a way to insulate the downstream profits from being a contribution towards stranded costs, and sort of could preserve the bidding incentives in the auction. Advanced services would be another source of revenues. It wouldn't really change the framework or the analysis very much. They would just be capitalized into the bidding incentives, and to the extent that the winner would be able to earn additional revenues from advanced services, the subsidies would be lower. I think this is one of the advantages of the outcome of the proposal. So to conclude, the structural separation in this context, as in other contexts, potentially enables competition by enforcing non-discriminatory access to network elements. Above-cost access pricing can distort the competitive provision of universal service in high-cost areas by creating incentives for inefficient bypass, or perhaps by discouraging participation in the first place. And finally, reverse auctions may or may not succeed in reducing subsidies, which is probably in some beholders' eyes the purposes of these things. It might reduce subsidies to the extent that it enables profits from advanced services to effectively cross-subsidize the universal service obligations. It's likely to reduce subsidies also to the extent that it eliminates duplication in the payment of those subsidies by having a single recipient of those. On the other hand, there could be some upward pressure to the extent that access arrangements are above cost, and that could weaken bidding incentives, and the stranded cost problem may not go away. So if you may have an upstream company being compensated for stranded costs and a downstream company earning profits from selling resale services, which could be a source of upward pressure. Thank you.
Michael?
Well, 2 recent World Series championships hasn't changed the compulsion that a Boston Red Sox fan has to be really excited about baseball in April before the team breaks your heart. So I hope you'll forgive me if I begin by talking about baseball. This year in Boston, we've got a new young pitcher named Dave Aardsma. And who knows how good this kid's going to turn out to be, but he already has a distinction in the baseball world, which he's now the first person listed in the baseball encyclopedia, right? Because it's spelled A-A-R-D-S-M-A. I was glad that Roger Knoll came back in, because I'm sure I'll get a quick answer to this question. Can you think of any other baseball player whose last name begins with A-A? So there's Hank Aaron, and of course Hank Aaron had a brother, Tommy Aaron, and I couldn't think of any others. Okay, now I'll come at the end, I'll come back to this and tell you why I think that's relevant to our discussion today. Okay, so AT&T, and what do we learn about structural separation from the breakup? Well, whenever you have an industry where there are multiple stages of activity where they're all imperfectly competitive, there's this interest, this public policy interest in trying to modularize the competition at the different stages so that you can compete successfully at one stage without any distortion imposed from the other stage or any need to be vertically integrated. And economically, it creates a kind of problem that's sort of impossible to solve. Because on the one hand, the stuff that Joe was saying was completely right, that when you have these kinds of situations, there is an incentive for a firm that with market power at one stage to distort the competition at the other stage and to provide some sort of advantage for its own division. But the problem is that if you have imperfect competition at all the stages, the company at one stage has the strongest incentive to make sure that the other stage is most competitive. And so the problem with the separation is that you might be eliminating, from the competition, the company that has the strongest incentive to compete aggressively. So that's the basic dilemma. And so you can't get around the dilemma. So I'll try to follow a little bit in Ellie's shoes and say, well, what are the facts? And so I'm not going to focus just on the AT&T facts, but to try to look at what are the situations where we've either done structural separation or thought about doing structural separations, and what are the ones that have worked out and what are the ones that haven't worked out? Well, some people in the room have suggested otherwise today, but I think if you were to ask the people what's the big success story, the big success story is the AT&T breakup. So I'll grant that as a big success story. Now, what else has been a big success story? Or what other success stories are there? Well, arguably in electricity, in some parts of this country, in some parts of the world, the separation between distribution and generation has been a success. Now, what are the failures? Well, I would argue that anything involving content and distribution has been a failure. And I was talking with Bob Crandall at lunch, and he didn't immediately disagree with me, which I took as being a triumph. I'm sure that some people will. But the things to think about are, well, I first started thinking about cable, which is a relatively recent one. But of course, you have to go back to television with the prime time access rule and the financial interest and syndication rule. I don't think any economists think that those were particularly good ideas. And then you go back further and you go to movie theaters. And I don't know that we got, Bob was telling me that that the movie studios got great benefits themselves from being forced to divest themselves of movie theaters right before television hit. But that, in terms of the basic economics, I don't know that anyone would say that we got a great increase in competition based from that vertical separation. And in cable, while I don't think there was any actual damage done in causing separation, if vertical separation had been imposed, it would have been a disaster. Because one of the long-standing issues in cable was, why didn't cable programming develop sooner than it did? And the reason, I think, was because of the fragmentation of the industry, both vertically and horizontally. And the problem was, you'd put together a network, and there'd be a big fixed cost to the network, and then you'd go to every cable operator, and every cable operator would try to bargain you down to marginal cost. And so there'd be no way to recover the cost of that programming. And the only way to solve it, right, Turner was about to go bankrupt, and the only way to solve it was to get the cable operators to invest in those networks. And of course, they had these big sunk investments in their network, so they were the ones who had the incentive to invest in the programming to fill those networks. And if you had prevented them from doing that, it would have caused cable programming to develop even slower than it did. What are the other failures? Well, in my opinion, Microsoft was a terrible failure. Now, of course, we didn't break them up. If you think about the business, you can say, well, there's this thing called the operating system that's supposed to be something that's common for everybody to use, and all the programmers to use, and you don't, and somehow you don't want the company that controls the operating system to be able to distort any of the competition in the applications market. But the problem is that if you control the operating system, you're the one who has the strongest incentive to bring out really good applications that are going to make people buy the computers to use your operating system. And when Microsoft switched, when they came out with Windows, they had a huge problem in getting the applications written. WordPerfect and wasn't that interested in developing a really good Windows application, and so Microsoft needed really good applications, and if you forced the vertical separation, you were going to eliminate from the market the company that had the strongest incentive to deliver the good product. Okay, so what other failures have there been? Well, I mean, divide the failures between the failures that had to be failures, in my view, and the failures that might have worked out okay but didn't. So it seems to me that with the content delivery issues, those were doomed to failure. That with Microsoft, vertical separation was doomed to failure. What were the failures that weren't doomed? Well, I said electricity worked out some places but not others. Well, there were definitely some places where it worked out terribly, California. So that was avoidable because you could have set up the market mechanisms better than they did. But it's a risk when you do vertical separate, when you try to modularize the competition, that you're going to mangle how you regulate that interface, and that's something you need to recognize. The other big failure, it seems to me, was the 1996 Telecom Act with the modularization of the components of the local exchange, and I sort of agree with what Glenn was saying before lunch, which is that the problem was that there was such concern that the prices would be set in a way that the incumbent would have an advantage over the entrance, that the standards for setting the prices were set so low that you eliminated any incentive to, probably not any incentive, but you eliminated much of the incentive to build your own network rather than to lease the elements of the network at a really low regulated price. Okay, so what are the common, what are the principles underlying the cases that have worked out from the cases that haven't worked out? Well, if you start with the AT&T decision, you might look at that and say, well, what we did was we identified a part of this industry that was susceptible, that could be competitive, and so whenever you identify a piece that can be competitive, you want to carve that out. But I think that's actually not the right way to think about it. You shouldn't be thinking about the piece of it that can be competitive, because when you, as a matter of public policy, mandate modularization of competition, there's always going to be a piece of it that remains regulated. It was another point that Glenn was making. And it's similar to the point that Jerry was also making, that there's a piece of it that's going to remain regulated. So what you have to think about is is it feasible, for the piece that's going to remain regulated, is it feasible to do that regulation in a sensible way, right? And so if you look at the failures, the problem with Microsoft and trying to modularize the competition around the operating system is that the operating system is not something that's sufficiently well defined that's a simple interface. If you look at the content delivery examples, it'd be one thing if it made sense to be selling cable television a la carte, but given that it's probably an essential feature of the industry that the service be bundled, it's too hard to regulate exactly what it is the deliverer should be delivering. So the regulatory piece of it is very hard to solve. In the case of the '96 Telecom Act, even though it might in principle have been something you could solve, once you went from regulating the price of services to final consumers to regulating all of the individual elements, you had this much more complicated regulatory problem that was susceptible to being mangled. So what are the successes? Well, right, the two successes, electricity and the AT&T breakup. Think about what the regulated pieces were. Well, the regulated pieces were the pieces that we'd had a lot of history regulating already. We were already regulating, and at least for a while, it wasn't that hard to solve the regulation piece of what still had to be regulated, right? So if you buy that, then what are the lessons to be learned for the future? And as Joe said, we're talking about net neutrality. Well, with net neutrality, part of it is saying that the companies doing the delivery can't get into content, and it seems to me that's a problem for the reasons that the content delivery attempts or consideration of modularization were mistakes in the past, right? And then the question is, well, how about these pricing issues? Can you regulate? Do you want to mandate a zero price, or can you regulate the prices for superior delivery, or can you regulate congestion pricing of some sort? And I would say that that's different from what we had in AT&T and with electricity because it's a new industry, and because we don't have the experience to be confident that we can get those regulations right. So in my mind, if you ask the question, what are the examples of successful modularization of competition, the answer is a lot like the answer to the question, how many Major League Baseball players have last names that begin with AA? That it's a very small number of cases. And it may be that one of them was really great, right? That the AT&T breakup might very well be the Hank Aaron of the modularization of competition. But it's still rare, and as we think about the implications of the AT&T breakup for the net neutrality debate, my advice would be let's tread very carefully. Thanks.
Well, can I ask you all to thank the panelists, and then we'll move to questions? That's great. Okay, do we have questions? Yeah, I'm going to walk this up because I'm tired of sitting down.
This doesn't work. Is it on? Ellie and I have been over this ground before, but the attempt to portray economic concentration the way Ellie does doesn't lead anywhere as far as telling us anything about competition, because his big increase in a decrease in concentration comes from splitting up the Bell Company into a lot of separate operating companies, and it's obvious that the people in Los Angeles didn't get any more competition from the fact that Houston was split off from Los Angeles, and secondly, you don't take into account how the relevant market has changed. Over time, you can't talk about the concentration of telecom revenues or ILEC revenues. You've got to include cellular revenues, and you've got to include cable revenues now from telephone service because they're all competing with one another. So I don't know where you go with this analysis of the concentration of revenues. I mean, Canada could look very good in your portrayal of things if Canada had pursued a policy of saying that they must have one telephone company for every province. That would have made your analysis of Canada look much less concentrated, but it had nothing to do with economic competition in Canada whatsoever. The one big difference between us and Canada is that their cellular companies are not as competitive as ours, and that's a big difference, and I'm not sure it shows up in your numbers at all.
If I can respond to it? Well, one of the problems of having only 12 or so minutes is that I cannot present several hundred possible slides, although I do my best. And that is that I have the answers to your concerns. What I did show was kind of in a way the aggregation of the aggregation of the aggregation, just to give you the big picture. But I do have specific submarkets and submarkets, and in fact one of the things I showed were local markets that do exactly respond to your point, and that's based on 60 local markets of medium and large and small size, where I did measure the actual concentration in those submarkets. So it's not just kind of parallel national markets that I showed on that particular graph. So your point is well taken, but I think I can deal with it, and I do.
It's still merger policy that's driving the results.
I'm not sure why that would be the case for, say, for local broadband. I mean, where you have a kind of an emerging duopoly type system. Why is this a merger policy issue?
I think this works. Wireless mergers.
Because what?
There's been wireless mergers. But the Bell South SBC singular AT&T story is that's a merger, right? And that's one of probably the biggest single thing that caused your numbers to change.
Well, kind of when you look at national numbers, yes, of course, that's
Wireless.
It's true, but so what? I'm not kind of explaining that that's kind of the natural equilibrium. I'm just kind of observing that that's kind of the empirical trend that we have encountered after a lot of back and a lot of forth in the courts and in the legislation and in the commissions and what have you. That is what we reached.
One of the hard things about having facts is that people can actually suggest it's a lot easier to state concepts, huh?
If you start with divestiture, it's a policy decision of administration T.
Yeah.
And then administration T+4 decides we're going to let them reform in a way that causes the concentration to be higher. That doesn't say anything about the underlying economic process. It's a political economy issue. And it doesn't mean administration T was right and T4 was wrong, or the opposite. It just means it has nothing to do with anything going on in the market.
Well, that's true, but that's also true for the initial divestiture. So you cannot just kind of pick one that you like and then kind of not pick the other one you don't.
Tim, you.
I have a question, I guess, for Mr. Farrell and also Mr. Salinger.
Will you help me use this? Okay. You know, both of you are looking, and I guess this whole panel is looking for a better understanding of the economics of modularity, of trying to understand what parts of the industry in some way can you in a clean way have broken off from other parts of the industry in a way that actually makes things better as opposed to making things worse. I mean, some way that's what this whole conference is about. When can you success? And I think that's hard for all of us. You know, it's hard for everyone to guess what is the right line to draw. But if you do it right, you get what you were talking about, which is it may be that what you called an interesting industry can only thrive when it is somehow separated from the boring industry and the standards in the boring industry. But I guess my question, that was my comment. My question to Michael is, if we're looking for more and less modular industries, one of the features of the internet is that it is designed from its basic protocols to be as modular as possible. So in some ways, doesn't that make it, whether you use regulation or not, I mean, I would say that it's already functioning and benefiting from the economics of modularity already by having the separation between transmission, addressing, and applications. So in some ways, it might be, whether or not you want to have regulation, it is definitely a network that has already profited from modularization.
Well, there's modularity in the internet in a way like there's modularity in computers between the operating system and applications. And the fact that you let the operating system company also do applications doesn't prevent there being other applications being written. And I mean, Joe and the other people who were at the Justice Department at the time they brought the Microsoft case, will point out that there are bad things that things that in an ideal world you wouldn't like the operating system company to do. And with the internet, there are conceivably things that the ISP can do. And I mean, there is this Madison River case, and I haven't heard anyone say that the FCC was wrong in taking action to prevent that. And if I were forced to take the other side of what I said, what I would say you might say, look, the internet looks a lot different from cable TV, because the problem with cable TV was the cable programming wasn't being developed, whereas with the internet, it seems like there's a ton of content that's being developed. So you don't necessarily need the ISP to be involved in the content development, but that's looking at the content that we have so far, and we don't know what the potential is for content that we might get in the future that might require really massive investment that unless you were the ISP, trying to promote your service, you wouldn't get.
Can I take the moderator's prerogative? Because I think there's a perspective that some folks in this room, at least that I work with at the FCC, might want to give to your question about, where are you going to separate if you're going to separate, which is what you're asking on some level. And I think, Joe, something you said which struck me, and I open it up for discussion, is you implied in your comments that what drove DSL deployment was, I heard it as line sharing, the line sharing order, or the having those the North Points and the others come into the market that were reliant upon a kind of a line sharing model. And I tell you, from what seems to have worked and what drove DSL is the presence of cable. It also is what differentiates the ISP competition in Europe versus the competition you see today in the United States. And I think one of the things that one asks about, because we're throwing around a lot of terms about content versus services competition versus facilities competition. One of the questions you have to ask is, when you've looked and seen what's driven the kinds of certainly the development of the network infrastructure, it really hasn't been through a separation in a traditional sense or in a regulated sense on the line sharing. I was involved with that. I know John was involved. We thought that made sense to have wavelength basically unbundling, but it proved to be unsustainable. What proved to be, and I would also say what proved to be unsustainable, surprisingly, was creating ISP competition. You know, the Computer 3, Computer 2 regime, the winners of that were the application providers. There was a lot of innovation there. It was not the ISPs. Those folks, despite heavy regulatory involvement, have not been successful. AOL is not successful ISP, pure ISP, nor is Earthlink. I mean, what you see emerging is innovation in the providers of the applications, but also innovation in the network providers and some integration, and also driven a lot by kind of some of this intermodal competition. So I open it up as a question of, where do you create the modularity? Where is it that you're going to see that? Sure.
I just feel strong about this, but someone else wants to say. I mean, I think the problem, and one of the problems with this whole conference, is that we keep looking to regulation to create modularity. When really it's the technology leads and the regulation should follow. And my point about the internet is designed, and the reason it's been so successful, nothing to do with the laws, nothing to do with the regulations and people guessing, but mostly to do with its technical structure, TCP/IP protocol, which is radically modularized. Mm-hmm. And so, I guess all my point here is that when looking for this successful modularization that Michael is looking for and everyone here is looking for, the place probably to start is with the protocols and the technology, and look what it's doing itself in this area.
I think that's a fair statement.
Well, I'm not sure I do. So, I mean, you can talk about the clean opportunity technically to modularize, and that goes back to, I think, Jerry Faulhaber's first condition this morning, which is that if the interface is sufficiently simple, that's a big plus. I'm not sure whether it was one of two jointly necessary and individually sufficient conditions, or whether it was just a big plus, but it was certainly a big plus. But if the economics evolve in the direction of economic links undoing that technical modularity, I'm not sure where you've got to, other than an opportunity for regulation potentially to step in and try to prevent that. That's not to say whether it's a good idea or not. So I don't think you can say it's just the technology. I think the technology can, of course, make it easier or harder to either spontaneously for an industry, as happened with the modularization of the computer industry away from the old silo mode, or for regulators to modularize. But I don't think one can separate those out further than that.
Yeah, look, you might get the industry might choose modularization, but if we're having a public policy discussion about modularization, you're saying, well, we're relying on regulation to do it. You can't mandate modularization without mandating the terms under which the modularization occurs, and so you have to regulate. I mean, it's inherently a regulatory problem.
I think my point here is to move forward where we are from now, which is to say, forget about regulation for the moment, okay? And whether, although having come from Bell Labs, you would think I would be technology uber alles, but I'm not quite. The fact is, something will emerge in the market. Joe's example of what happened after the era of IBM and DEC, which was a highly integrated, not at all modularized, the whole vertical chain was very much integrated, to within 5 years a complete disintegration of the vertical chain. Now, this didn't happen from regulation. It happened to some extent from the forces of the market and the forces of technology, which work together. They're not separate, okay? What we saw with, of course, if it's the internet, we call it the OSI stack. We don't call it, vertical disintegration. But basically, it was designed to do that. However, all of these things evolve in the market. Just, forget about regulation. These things evolve. And we see this happening, with lots of us being dragged kicking and screaming away from the E2E principle. We see it happening in the internet. And those protocols will evolve, and they will not necessarily stay separate. Now, do we want to interfere with that process? And I think what Michael is saying, and I tend to be supportive of it, probably not going to work. The best you can do is not screw it up. Mm-hmm. Okay? And if you try to get in the way of that, seriously, and regulators are going to step in, sorry, Jonathan, it's not going to, it's going to end in tears, okay? That's where it's going to go. So the notion that we can somehow step in and either mandate an existing modularization, a la end-to-end, or come up with a new modularization, and that's actually going to work, I think is, public policy hubris.
Yeah, sure.
Perhaps it's worth saying something about the different mechanisms of regulatory influence here. Seems to me there are at least three different models. One is rules that prevent problems from cropping up. You're not allowed to do X, and this rule is in some sense expected to be promptly and vigorously enforced, so you just don't do it. This may get to your international comparisons. A second, which is related but a little bit different, is deterrence. You could do that, but we would come down on you like a ton of bricks, so you won't. That one requires vigor and determination and a certain ruthlessness on the part of the regulatory system. It doesn't require rapid response. You can think about it for a long time and then come down on them like a ton of bricks. And if they foresee it, they'll still be deterred. And a third is repair. We didn't prevent it in advance. We're not going to be punitive about it. But as we see problems cropping up, we will in some way try to push back and make things happen differently. I think it might be, obviously there are many topics here, but one interesting topic is what's the appropriate mix of those or other approaches if indeed something ought to be done?
Would you see what you just described as a spectrum between regulation and antitrust?
I don't know.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to get back to something Michael said. Michael, as I took it, was in describing the trade-off, was talking about the tension of avoiding problems with vertical foreclosure if you have an integrated firm, but losing some of the advantages of avoiding double marginalization if you have a single firm. But there are other dimensions to that trade-off that are significant. One of them has to do with the incentives that management has as you take a structure that might be relatively horizontal and make it vertical. And I think there are many institutions where the high-powered incentives you need to instill incentives to innovate somehow dissipate as the institution gets more vertical. And I'm not sure we fully understand why that is, but the fact of the matter is that if we take the Microsoft software kind of example, and you look for innovations that were done by smaller firms that were not vertically integrated include word processing, email, spreadsheets, GUI, web browsers, instant messaging, hardware recognition. So we have to ask ourselves, if it's so important that we reverse the process and sort of vertically integrate firms, are we going to lose some of that innovation? And are we going to lose some of those strong vertical incentives? Another way I think about it is having taken a follow on what Dartha was saying, having looked very closely at AOL Time Warner at the time. I was not involved in regulating it, but I was watching it very closely. I was thinking at the time there might be some reasons for this merger, but if you asked me whether I could break it up, I would have done so instantly, and it would have been because I wouldn't have seen any obvious tremendous incentives, but I would have seen two institutions that would not generate the right kind of high-powered incentives. So I think we have to add these other dimensions to this consideration when we're thinking about the right way to modularize.
I think our time is up. If we're going to stay on track here, I want to thank everyone and the participation of the panel.